The weather in Nashville has been lovely all this week as I have been sitting behind my desk at my day job. And now, as you can guess, if you can't already hear, oh yeah, that is the sound of a downpour on Saturday morning. Lovely. So, I'm going to make do as best I can with the weather not cooperating with me. One of the things that I'm going to do is the rough milling of all the lumber that I have for the guitar. Behind me here is some sapele that quarter-sawn sapele that I got from the local lumber yard. And I chose this because it has this nice ribbon figure to it. However, one of the things I'm going to have to do is either resaw this to try and pull the veneer off of the top of it, or do a whole lot of planing, because this happens to be 8/4 instead of 7/4. They didn't have anything that was closer to 1 3/4 of an inch. So yeah, I'm going to have to make do with what I have there. For the neck, I have the last big chunk of hard maple that I have in my shop from one of my original purchases. This is going to be what I make the neck out of. This has been drying in my shop for about 6 years or so, so this guy's going to be nice and stable. And then I also have this lovely piece of Bolivian rosewood that I'm going to be using for the fingerboard. With this, it unfortunately is not quite 3/4 of an inch thick, so I'm not going to be able to resaw it into 3 fingerboards. I'm only going to be able to resaw it into 2. Kind of a shame, but that's just kind of the nature of the beast. So yeah, that's the sort of thing that a lot of people have made plenty of videos about. There's no point in me videoing me feeding stuff through a planer for a good half hour on end, nor the resawing part. I'm just going to skip that because we all know what that looks like. When I come back to actually joining the two halves of the body together, I'll video that part because I use a hand plane to do that, and a light test to make sure that I've got the smallest gap possible between the 2 plates. And I'll show how that technique works. Yeah, stay tuned. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the machine setup for the CNC. So I've got the body blank mounted in the CNC. The clamps are not yet tight. Now I do have a 0 rail that runs down the X and the Y axis here. However, for this cutting plan, I'm actually going to be using the center line of the guitar. Now, because the cuts may not be exactly parallel, because I hand planed the joint, and so I may have traveled up or downhill a little bit. This may not be exactly parallel. So what I've done is I've just loosely slid in, it's not even tightened down, a pointed bit that I'm going to use to make sure that my alignment is correct. So as I jog the machine over to where I think the center line is going to be, we're pretty close up on it. Okay. This becomes the eyeballing part, which is always a little difficult. My center line is very hard to see. So. Okay, there we go. Okay, I've got one last thing to do before we can get started, which is to zero the Z-axis. But at first I thought I would give you a panoramic shot of my setup here. So this is just an old crap monitor from someplace, keyboard and mouse from junk heap. And then the actual brains and controller of the CNC. I run this off of a Raspberry Pi. which then hooks up to the Arduino Uno under here, which actually does the hardware side of things. And then I'm using a program called BCNC as my pendant, which lets me control the XYZ placement, load programs, all that jazz, which then just come off the little flash card there. The switching button here, change this from the router to the laser head, because I happen to have a 5-watt laser for this as well. I do have a zero probe. I never use it though. It works pretty good, but the times that it messes up, it really messes up. So I tend to use the sheet of paper method. So yeah, of course, in case you hadn't noticed from a previous video, the router head has googly eyes on it. Violet, when I first put the machine together, she thought the router kind of looked like a minion from the movie of the same characters, right? And of course, then she had to go stick some googly eyes on it, which is hilarious when it runs because they shake and it looks like the machine's having a fit. And ever since then, I've always kept a pair stuck to it, even though those are not the originals. When I've had to replace the brushes in the router, one of the screws for the housing is under one of the eyes, and so I have to always pull them off and replace them. But yeah, so I'm going to put the camera back in the tripod and set up the time lapse, and we'll get rolling. Okay, that was dusty. Yeah, so yeah, I have the control cavity deep into the right depth, the truss rod block channel cut all the way through, and then the angle recess, whatever the right term is here, for the output jack cut. Okay. And while I was doing my layout lines, I went ahead and did the layout for the arm contour and the belly cut back here. Whoops. Let me try that again. The arm contour and the belly cut back here. Now, with this, I've made some kind of careful measurements about how far back I can come this way and how deep I can come this way, lest I run into this channel right there where the wiring conduit goes. So yeah, there's about at least a quarter of an inch leeway from where I drew those lines. Now obviously I could have had the CNC cut this arm contour off for me, but the reality of it is just a lot of machining for a cut that is not measurement critical, right? I mean, having the CNC cut the recess for the Floyd Rose perfectly in line with the pickups, perfectly in line with the next pickup, perfectly in line with the neck pocket's exactly the right size. That stuff matters, right? And if you watch the time lapse really closely, you'll see how I had the router jump on me and I took a little nick out of this corner that I didn't intend to. And so I just backed the line up a little bit and just cut a little deeper. So in that same vein, this arm contour is not really a precise measurement. So so what I'm going to do is essentially take a handsaw and cut a series of vertical lines through this. All right, not to the max full depth, but partway through, decent way partway through. And then I'm just going to knock the waste off with a chisel, and then come back with a hand plane and a spoke shave and contour this out to the shape I want. Because I intend to do an inlay on this contour here, I do need to be pretty good and flat. So for that, I'm going to end up using a hand plane, and thankfully, I was thinking ahead just a little bit, and because the grain angle's this way, I should be able to plane this this direction, right, coming downhill off the grain, and not have to worry about tear out too terribly much. Now, the technique, which I probably won't get to tonight because it is already late, for doing the belly cut, and there we are, is more or less the same. I'm just going to make some saw marks. I'm just going to make some saw cuts. There we go, there's a better view. I'm going to make some saw cuts across this and knock out the majority of the waste with the chisel, and then come back, rasp, spoke shave, and get this down to the shape that I want. recesses cut for the inlay on the arm contour. In the old days, this would have been done with mother of pearl or elephant ivory or baby seal teeth or something is equally environmentally horrifying. I'm going to be using a 2-part resin. I've been using the West System stuff for a while, and it works really well for me. You can mix this stuff by volume or by weight, and the latter which is the important part, because for small measures, the size that you would use to fill these types of inlays, trying to get the volume ratio exactly right is a real pain. You get it slightly under, the stuff never hardens, you get it slightly over, and the chemical reaction kicks off in moments, and then you have a brick on your hands before you can even get it poured. So, for that, you will need a small digital scale that goes down to the thousandth of the gram. Because most of the time you're only getting 1 or 2 grams tops when you mix up a batch of this stuff. For the coloring part, I have a collection of mica powders of various and sundry shades, along with some real crushed pearl. The goal is going to be to try and match the color of the little pearl inlays on the knobs that I picked for the guitar. And I'll get a close-up of this. For that part, I want to enlist the help of my partner. She has the tetrachromium mutation, so her color perception is incredible. So I'm going to enlist her help to get these as close as possible. So one of the problems with resin pours, if you've ever done any, is that air bubbles are your enemy. To that end, I have my homemade vacuum pot. This is just a piece of acrylic that I snagged from a bin somewhere at a sign shop, fitted with a pressure valve and a release valve, a pressure gauge and a release valve. The pot itself is just a stainless steel bucket I picked up from a hardware store. If you go searching for vacuum pot on or vacuum canister on any of your big box stores, online retailers, anything like that, they're stupid expensive. So this works well enough because all I really got to do is just get the air bubbles out. I don't have to make a perfect vacuum. To get the seal, this is just some silicone gasket maker that you just squeeze out of a tube and then set the lid down onto. And that actually makes the nice, perfectly flat gasket that seals pretty well. My vacuum pump is a kit that I got from a company called Woodworking.com. If you've ever priced vacuum presses, you know that they're horrendously expensive. So for all of the same capabilities and features, aside from like a digital readout, this just has an analog pressure gauge on it. I bought all the parts from Joe Woodworker and the instructions for the kit for about half the price of a commercial one. So yeah, it requires some woodworking, some cutting of PVC tubing, some gluing, some minor wiring, stuff that we should all be familiar with, right? So this was a much more economical and higher performing route to go for doing any sort of vacuum pressing or resin work like this. So yeah, these are the tools I'm going to be using. Alright, I have brought back the color expert.
Hello. Okay, so...
Alright, there's one of the knobs.
Yeah, the knobs. So we've got blue, green, pink, and maybe purple if you strain it.
Do you turn on the little desk lamp?
Yeah.
I need to replace this bulb with one that doesn't suck.
Eventually, yeah.
Well, it's a halogen. Come on. Cooperate.
There we go.
Really? There we go.
Okay, got... Yeah. You've got all 3 cool colors plus pink.
Okay, so is this one of these things where I need to mix them up separately? because it's likely to go one uniform shade.
Yeah, and that's not what you want, because if you look at it, you've got the different flecks of color in white.
Uh-huh.
And you want to do something that's similar. And the problem is that this is just a pearlescent white.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any other colors in it. And this is basically yellow.
That's the real pearl.
Yeah, but it's basically yellow.
Okay.
Like, it's also pearlescent. It's better than this one, but it's just plain kind of shimmery is the problem. Okay, this one is actually yellow, so we don't want that one. Okay, and those are not what we want. Okay. Do you want to try with this one, the plain white? Do you want to see if we can add a tiny bit of the pink to it, and if it actually goes super, super pink? I mean, like tiny, tiny, tiny amount.
Sure. I've got some little tester cups we can use.
Okay. Here's the pink. Okay, let's use this one.
These little lids will work. And, well, I need to bring the house for more toothpicks. Okay.
Pardon my smoke.
Okay. Okay, hang on a second. Toothpicks to stir with. Pipe
No,
in.
no, I don't, no. I'm just mixing the pigment.
Okay.
Just the pigment. Okay.
I figured it'd be hard to tell it wasn't actually in the resin.
Maybe for you. Well, that's why you called me out here, right?
Yes, I know.
Okay. I'm going to try it with the pink. It says purple, but it's wrong.
Yeah, that is not really purple.
It's magenta, if it's anything. Or fuchsia, maybe. Okay.
So I'm afraid you won't be able to tell unless it's actually dissolved.
Well, we can try dissolving it. Add a little bit of this. All over my hands.
Oh yeah, this stuff is.
Come on.
To say that this stuff is a fine powder is an understatement. And that's part of the time I'm talking to the camera.
I know. Ooh, that might be a little much green. But green is a very dominant color in that, so it might be okay. This one. Okay. Alright. I'm gonna add a tiny bit more white because... Alright, go ahead and get some of the resin then. Let's see if this works. I don't need that much. Get it off.
Okay. And of course, our ratio of resin to powder here is insanely wrong.
Oh yes, very, very wrong. But you can change that in the final cut. All right, go ahead. Okay, a tiny bit. Ooh,
Sorry.
more than that.
Yeah.
That's all bubbles.
Yeah. Turns out the stuff is a little on the viscous side.
And end up with oobleck. Okay, that's plenty. That's plenty.
Okay. Squeeze droppers to the rescue.
Okay, one minute's just white.
Yeah, see, that's... I'm not crazy. Because I looked at it and went, it's just slightly less white than it was before.
Yeah, so... yeah, that just looks gray. Because the problem is what you're mostly getting is resin.
Yeah.
You're not mostly getting the pigment.
I think the small batch idea, doing like small batches of individual colors and mixing it actually in the inlay is probably going to be our best route then. Because then you can pour the different colored resins together and not really mix them.
Right.
But it means
But it's not going to look like this.
No. But at least the colors will kind of stay separated a little bit.
Okay, if you do that, you have to use the lighter variations of everything.
Okay.
So
then
otherwise, it's going to overpower the white. So you need to use the lighter green,
the sky blue.
the sky blue, which is the lighter of the blues,
Okay.
and then the purple, even though it's not really purple. Like I would do those three, and I wouldn't do any other ones because
And
otherwise
no
they're
yellow.
too dark. No, the whole guitar's theme is yellow because of the brass. Brass is by definition yellow.
Right.
So you have way enough yellow already in the guitar because the majority of the color scheme of the guitar is yellows and oranges and some reds, depending on how you look at the Floyd Rose. These are your cool colors that are going to match these.
Okay. All right.
Well, mostly cool. That is pushing it.
All right. Well.
So, but even then, if you're going to do it that way, I would do very lightly colored on those resins. Like, don't put very much pigment into those resins, otherwise they'll overpower, and you'll just have spots or obvious swirls that aren't going to look good in either of those spots. It's just going to look weird. So if you have a more diluted resin, as
Or I
opposed to
use
the...
very, very little of it, like toothpick dropper size, very little.
and then kind of swirl it in, that might work.
Okay. All right.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks.
Bye guys!
guys, as far as jigs go, this is a pretty straightforward one. So I have my blank from the fretboard, and I have a simple CNC program that the only thing that it does is it punches a pair of holes in the back here that are about 1/16 of an inch deep, about 1/8 of an inch wide, that corresponds to a pair of pins here on this fixture that I want to mount to the CNC machine. And what this lets me do is this corner down here is exactly 0, 0 on the CNC, so that I have a reference point for carving the rest of the fingerboard out without having to worry about getting everything exactly measured by eye each time. I'm relying on the CNC to do that because the CNC punched these holes for these pins. Therefore, mathematically, right, I should not have to worry about manually aligning everything. I just rely on the CNC to do that. So I'm going to adhere this down to the fixture with a bit of double-sided tape, making sure to line these pins up, and then I have the rest of the programs on the CNC set up to do the 12-inch radius, then cut the perimeter of the fretboard out, and then do the fret slotting. Okay, so here's the fretboard, fresh off the CNC machine. As you can tell, it has been radiused, slotted, and trimmed to the correct size. However, the radiusing process leaves a few sort of track marks from the ball nose bit. I can feel them with my finger, but I don't believe that they're going to show up on camera. It's a side effect of the fact that each time that the cutting pass steps over a little bit, it leaves just a little bit of a track. Now I could solve that problem by making smaller and smaller step overs, but that would just increase the machining time. So, ye old trusty sanding block. So this is a 12-inch radius sanding block that I just machined on the CNC out of a piece of scrap. Then I'm going to stick some 200 grit sandpaper to and sand off these marks. I'm going to leave this on the jig for the moment because what I'm going to do is take a piece of MDF and double stick tape it to this side to make sure that as I am sanding out the marks, I'm not twisting my radius block and thus sanding myself out of the proper radius. After that, then it will be time to trim and install frets. These are Max Jumbo stainless steel frets. 150S is the product number for those. I put these in a couple of guitars. I really like them. But yeah, they're stainless steel, so this is going to take a little more sanding than the typical nickel steel ones. Okay, so I have all of the marks from the milling sanded off. Use my radius block. And then the next thing I'm going to do is a little unusual. So if you ask yourself, what do they use for sandpaper, right? It turns out that they made polishing tools out of things like reeds, or in this case, broom. There's a French name for this, which I won't try to pronounce. I'll look up the correct spelling of it and put it in the comments below, or the highlights below. But essentially, this is just a part of a broom that I've brutalized and tied the straw together as close as I can, and then as tightly as I could, and then just dip the end of this in beeswax. They make these things you can sell. Try that again. They sell these things commercially under the French name I made this one myself just because I was curious to try it out. And it worked well enough that I never bothered to buy one. So here's the general idea. This doesn't really take off any material, but it burnishes and sort of smooths out the surface as it kind of goes. And it beds a little bit of the wax into it. So you can kind of see, and hopefully I can get the glare of this correct. This section down here at the end is slightly shinier than this up here at the front. I don't know if that's going to come out on camera well. But that's the idea. The more patience you take at it, the more pressure you apply, the better the effect. So I'm going to take a run with this for a little bit and get the fretboard nice and smooth and very polished feeling. That's the effect that this will have. So, see when I'm done. Okay, there we go. So that's just with about 10-15 minutes of using the French polisher, whatever this device is called. Again, I'll put the name in the comments. So once we get down to the actual finishing stage and buffing everything, this is going to come out really nice. It's already smooth as glass. That just means that once we get down to the buffing part, that it's actually going to have a much finer finish. So yeah. Next up, frets. Okay, so I have the fret edges filed, at least on the vertical side at this point, so that there's no more tangs overhanging the edge of the fretboard. You can kind of see, hopefully, if the camera will cooperate with me, how the tape has been worn away, mostly all the way down the board. And this is kind of the indicator to know that I've gotten fairly good and flush. For the few that were being slightly stubborn, little diamond rasp was to the rescue in this case. So, same thing on this side here. Next up is beveling the edges of the frets. I have essentially the same type of tool. It is a homemade version of the product that you can buy from any of the number of places. The only difference with this one is that at one point I happen to have a few minutes with a angle grinder, and I cut the tang off of this file. Otherwise, this file and this one right here are exactly the same one. This block, built the same way. This was just cut on a 45-degree angle with the table saw. So now it's down to beveling the edges of the frets. I'll save a final dressing and the final perfecting and tuning and getting really picky about it until after the guitar is assembled, because once the fretboard is glued to the neck, obviously I'll be doing some sanding and such, and that may expose more rough spots as I lightly sand some of the rosewood. So this would be a 95% of the way there job, so to speak, with this block, and then I will fine tune once the guitar is in its final assembly and setup stages. I have my neck blank milled down to 1.5 inches thickness this direction. And now the next step is to cut the truss rod channels, alignment holes, channels for the carbon graphite rods, and to angle the headstock. Now, I could just mount this on the CNC and let the CNC do all the work. However, that's just a lot of machining time for it to carve the angle on the headstock, when the reality of it is I can use the bandsaw to rough cut that and save myself a lot of just machining time on the CNC. Now, to solve that, I've made another 3D model that is the shape of the neck blank, so to speak, right? Which then the CNC machine can use to calculate what material it does have to remove and what material it doesn't, right? So in this case, the CNC machine believes that instead of starting with a square piece of stock, they started with a piece of stock that has this profile, right? So it knows that all it really has to do is sculpt the face of this instead of having to remove all of this material down here. Right? So this model, if you look at it in the 3D modeling program, and I guess I can overlay a shot of that here, is a little bit bigger than the actual neck model itself. So the CNC machine is only having to remove about a 1/16 of an inch of material from this slope here, because that's how much bigger that this is. When we get to machining the back of the neck, that's when this contour here will come into play. Basically, I machine the front of it, and then I have a fixture which lets me flip the neck over and hold it in the correct orientation in a known position so that I can then have the CNC carve the back of the neck. Same thing, this profile is much larger than the actual neck is going to be, but this gets me close enough that there's not a lot of time spent by the CNC just cutting away this material here. So while I am going to go ahead and draw the contours, or draw the shape on both the front and the back, at this point I am only going to cut the one off the front. And the reason for that is that I want the largest flat surface area back here to mount to the CNC to keep everything nice and flat as it is carving the channels on this side of the neck. Then when it comes time to machine the back, then my fixture for holding the neck in place uses this flat reference here and has a piece which accounts for this slope here so that this stays supported. I am getting a bit ahead of myself, but it will be obvious once we get to that point. Okay, so I'm just going to go basically down this side a little proud of this line, and then we will get to the CNC part. Okay, so here's the neck, rough cut right off the CNC. I went ahead and nicked off the end here and the end here, so you can see how far down the CNC actually cuts the neck out on the first pass. This is well far enough that I can then take a bandsaw and trim this the rest of the way out, and then use a router table to complete this cut here. so that I don't have to whenever I flip the neck over and machine the back on the CNC. Now, the reason that I've left the sides, cheeks on, so to speak, is so that I have the largest flat reference surface here for adjusting the truss rod channel. Invariably, whenever you order truss rods and you measure these things, there's always a little bit of variance in each individual one. So rather than cutting the channel oversized and having to deal with the potential for rattle, I tend to cut them a little undersized and then hand tune them with some chisels to get it down exactly right. So as we can tell here, it's all good right here, right? All nice and flat. But once we get up to about there, and I don't know if you can hear this, right? There's a little bit of rock, which means that the truss rod channel right here is just a little too shallow, which is usually what happens. It happens because of just, the variation in how this particular piece might or might not be welded together, or this particular piece of how well this was ground. So I'll take some fine chisels and increase the depth here just a little bit until this guy lays perfectly flush with the top of the truss rod channel. Then, using some standard two-part epoxy, in will go the carbon graphite rods. The channels for these I always cut them just slightly oversized for depth, because it's easy just to fill in the gap with the epoxy, rather than having to sand off the carbon graphite rod to make everything flush, because this stuff is disgusting. If you ever sand or cut it, it's bad. Also, you'll notice here the two alignment pinholes. There's one there at the end of that finger. There we go. There we go. Okay. There's a couple little bits of steel rod that go into these, and these are what ensure that the fretboard aligns exactly with where I want, where everything, make sure that everything aligns exactly correctly. Now, one thing that I do, which might seem a little counterintuitive, is I'll lay the fretboard on here, get it in about the right place. And this is going to be really hard to have show up on camera, but I hope that it will. Okay. Nope, you're about right there. Okay. All right. There is the very slightest overhang on the neck relative to the fretboard. I deliberately have the program which machines out the profile of the neck leave it a 64th large. And the reason why is so that I can sand the profile of the neck down to match the fretboard exactly, rather than trying to get everything to line up precisely so. The X-Carve is as good as a machine as it is, still is a hobbyist grade machine, so to speak, and backlash is a thing, and its ability to cut, down to the hundredths of an inch every single time, not always the case. So rather than fighting that fight of trying to get the fretboard and the neck to line up exactly right, it's easier to just deliberately cut this a little big and then sand to the fretboard size. It also means that the width of the tail, put that anywhere, the width of the tenon here on the neck is also a 64th oversized, which means that I can now sand this down to the exact width of the matching mortise in the body, to make sure that I have this nicest, snugest fit possible. And yeah, that's the gist of it. here's the neck, fresh off the CNC. Now, as you can tell, the parallel pass does not leave a perfectly smooth finish, right, as it hit on the face here. You can see kind of the track marks there. Same thing goes for the back. The parallel pass gets things mostly right, but it does leave some stair stepping in places, right? And because of the steepness of the wall here, or the steepness of the curve as at the edge of the fretboard, it doesn't cut all the way down the side. So you see I still got a nice big ridge there. And that gives me plenty of room to tune everything in by hand. And then essentially just a lot of it is just taking out the milling marks here. The heel will get sculpted to match the body once it's actually glued in. And part of that is it saves me trouble and duplicated effort of modeling the neck heel for every different body shape to make it match. The other problem is that it's just really complicated to get that set of curvature correct, and so I find it easier just to get this rough heel shape and then dial it into what I actually want entirely by hand. So yeah, so this neck is going to end up with the a relatively slim C shape, which is what I went for. Not a boat neck or not an Ibanez style, wizard where it's a very severe D shape, but this is a very slim C. With fretboard, we'll end up with something. Let's see, get the alignment pins about correct. Akin to, let's see if I can get this in the shot right, that kind of profile. So, not a baseball bat, not super shredder skinny. But yeah, so you can see now that I still have plenty of room here to get this contour tapered in as I want. So yeah, so next up, one of the things that I'm going to do is sand this flat, or a little flatter, and then do the headstock inlay, which I cut out while the CNC was running. And well, here we are. That's backwards, but I still have the paper on the front of it from where I cut it out. So yeah, this is a piece of rosewood, and this inlay will go right about there-ish, more or less. And then that's the next step, is to actually get this guy inlaid. I now have the neck rough sanded and the heel rough contoured to match the body. You can see hopefully it shows my camera. Come on. There we go. You can see my pencil line where I drew the body outline. So now it is time to do the side marker inlays. I've always hated the little tiny dots, and in fact, it's always been kind of an issue, right? Dark stage, you can't see the stupid things. I have a Titanium signature guitar, and on it, they have these really sort of wide 1/8 inch, stripes. They're made out of plastic on this one, so it's a black and a white stripe in a 3-ply laminate, kind of like this piece of pickguard here, right? And that's a really nice idea because they're really easy to see in the dark, and so it's one of the things I've always done with my guitars. Now, I typically use a contrasting piece of wood. So if I have maple neck, maple fingerboard, use a piece of rosewood. Mahogany neck, mahogany fingerboard, or rosewood fingerboard, use a piece of maple. And so the contrasting wood shows up very nicely. The trick here is, since I have rosewood and maple, neither of those two really work. I don't have any real ebony, something that's really jet black. And I don't want to use plastic, and this is not thick enough. And I don't have a molding machine to make, this sort of 3-ply laminate type stuff. But I do have a CNC. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to CNC out a little mold out of MDF. That's the width and size of the inlay pieces that I need, and I'm going to mix up some of the same resin that I used for the inlays on the body, tint it the same way, etc., and hopefully end up with something that looks like some sort of mother of pearl inlay. And that should give me enough contrast to stand out against both the rosewood and the maple here on the neck. Never done this before, doing this type of inlay, so this is going to be an adventure. We'll see how it goes.